Funding for this program was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation. Generations of families and friends who feel passionate about the programs they watch on Iowa Public Television.
It is history that breathes the breath into the relics of our past and makes them live again in us. It is not a unit of social studies on transportation or memorization of our state bird and state tree and state flower.
Tom Moraine, longtime historian in the state of Iowa, elaborates on how the stories of people who lived before us can enliven the dry bones of historical facts. In this speech recorded March 30th, 2012, on the Des Moines Area Community College campus in Ankeny. His appearance is the first in a series of speeches called the Dorothy Schweeder Iowa Talks Series, set up by the Iowa Studies Center, a collaborative history project of the Des Moines Area Community College and Salisbury House of Des Moines.
When you've been around Iowa history long enough, you discover a room like this. I know 95% of the people over 40. 3 weeks ago, my wife and I were still sleepy as the announcer on the 6:30 morning news report asked listeners if we had studied Iowa history in 5th grade. Her story was that there is a new textbook out on Iowa history and that she would be interviewing its two main authors, Dorothy Schweeder and Thomas Moraine, that morning at 10 o'clock on Iowa Public Radio. This was something of a wake-up call since at 6:30 and only half awake, my brain could recall no memory of any discussion of when, where, or with whom this session would occur that day. For her part, Dorothy Schweeder, a wise woman and retired, probably didn't hear that early morning news since women who are both wise and retired are less likely to have the radio switched on at 6:30. It turned out, of course, that the program was going to be a rebroadcast of the session we did last fall. The occasion then was the release of a 4th version of the Iowa history book to bring the story up to date from the year 2000, where the previous text ended. Biodiesel fuels, wind turbines, floods, tornadoes, Sean Johnson. We had said goodbye to Governor Branstad in Chapter 18, but he's back. We learned a little secret about the publishing world. The University of Iowa Press chooses to call this latest publication the revised 3rd edition rather than the 4th edition. If it's a new edition, you have to go back and secure new copyright permissions for every photograph in the whole book. But if it's only a revision, you don't. At the end of the original interview, the host asked Dorothy why she thinks it is important to teach children about the history of Iowa when, after all, we live in a global age. It's a question that comes up frequently for state and local historians. Dorothy launched into an impassioned plea to provide children with a sense of place, an understanding of how the community around them came to be, an appreciation of their own heritage. She and I were on the phone a few days later in a post-mortem, and I asked her about those last few moments of the interview. She laughed and said she didn't really remember exactly what she'd said, but she knew it came from the heart. It did indeed. It was a passion that had surfaced not just in those final minutes of a radio interview, but consistently through 4 decades when she taught over-enrolled undergraduate Iowa history courses, wrote a shelf full of books and articles, lectured across the state, and nurtured a new generation of Iowa historians. This was her consistent message. History matters, and local history is where we connect most easily and most directly to the people and the culture that have had the greatest impact in shaping who we are. Every year, my hometown Lamoni sponsors Civil War Days, a weekend of reenactments of military battles and camp life. 2 years ago, a Lutheran minister turned Graceland theater professor gave the sermon at the outdoor Sunday morning worship service. The congregation sat on hay bales and lawn chairs on the site of yesterday's battlefield. He shared with us a sermon that became popular among Lutherans after the Battle of Gettysburg. In that conflict, the Confederate general, Robert E. Lee, set up command headquarters at the local Lutheran seminary. On the third day of the battle, Lee ordered Pickett's charge, a slaughter of Southern troops that attempted but failed to break through the Union lines, a failure that foretold the doom of the Confederate cause. Following the battle, the Lutheran Seminary president preached a sermon from the Old Testament based on the famous story of the prophet Ezekiel's dream watching dead bones come back to life. Dead bones was more than a metaphor at a battlefield where some 50,000 men, just about the entire population of Ankeny today, 50,000 men were killed or wounded in only 3 days of fighting. Because this year's Civil War days and that public radio interview were floating around in my head together, I realized in that marvelous and mysterious process called serendipity that sermon on the Ezekiel text harmonized beautifully with Dorothy's closing remarks in the radio interview. The biblical account describes Ezekiel's dream where he is placed in a valley filled with dry bones. The bones become a metaphor for the people of Israel who, in losing touch with their religious roots, have become a people of dry bones who yet could live again if they recover that memory. Therefore, while I realize that most of you could recite Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 through 10 by heart, I have chosen to read it again to you as my own sermon text for this occasion. I will do it in my best James Earl Jones voice. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of the valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? I said, Sovereign Lord, you alone know. Then he said to me, Prophesy to these bones and say to them, Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared upon them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then the Lord said to me, Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, Son of man, and say to it, This is what the Sovereign Lord says. Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up upon their feet, a vast army. We are surrounded everywhere by evidence of our past. Old photographs, street names, antiques, traditions. They are like the bones in Ezekiel's dream, evidence that there has been life before us, but by themselves they are meaningless. It is history that breathes life into them, history that explains our relationship to them and how they have shaped us. Without history, they will remain disconnected from each other and from us, dry bones indeed. I would like to talk about three kinds of bones today: historical artifacts or things, historical processes, historical places. The categories aren't really that important, but I've listed them for the benefit of those of you who have been required to attend this lecture as a class assignment. When I start talking about point 3, historical places, take heart, for we will be nearing the end. It was when I worked at Living History Farms that I discovered author Freeman Tilden's marvelous little book, Interpreting Our Heritage, on teaching history at historic sites. Interpreting, Tilden writes, is an educational activity that aims to reveal meanings and relationships through the use of original objects and first-hand experience, rather than simply to communicate factual information. Meanings and relationships. Historical interpretation should go beyond memorization of facts. Tilden writes that his goal in interpretation is provocation, to provoke the visitor into considering what the significance of the factual information might be. So what's important about old things? They are certainly important to museums. Collections are museums' stock in trade. But no one ever asked me during my 13 years at Living History Farms, would you explain the impact of industrialization on agriculture and rural life in the upper Mississippi Valley from 1700 to 1950? No one ever asked me that question. The most common question from visitors, what's that? It came from a second grader pointing to a washboard in a bucket of suds. It came from a teenager spying a powder horn hanging from the wall of a log cabin. It came from an elderly man noticing a breed of hogs he had never seen before. Good museums deliberately position artifacts where they will catch the attention of visitors to pique their interest, to provoke them to ask that simple question, what's that? We know the thing has a story and we want to hear it. What does it mean? Meanings and relationships. The artifact is the bone. History, the story of the thing, is the flesh and muscle that ties it into a bigger picture and gives it breath. It is one thing to look at a khaki World War II uniform on a mannequin. It is quite another to learn that you are looking at a uniform worn by a 1900 Iowa farm kid when he hit the beach at Normandy, scared spitless that he was about to die. I want to share a personal experience that Vicki and I had on a 4-day whirlwind trip to London. The highlight was lunch in the dining room of the British House of Lords with the late Richard Lord Acton. Richard's wife, Patricia, is a professor at the University of Iowa Law School, so they spent one half of the year in Cedar Rapids and one half of the year in London when Parliament was in session. Richard loved Iowa history, and the Moraines and Actons became good friends. When Richard heard we were coming to London, he insisted that we be his guests at the House of Lords. Well, we said, okay, but just this once. And then we sat through a session in the balcony of the House of Lords, and it was fantastic. The ritual, the tradition, the architecture. Afterward, Richard had a 30-minute committee meeting, so he found a babysitter to take care of us, and he recruited an archivist and told the archivist, find something that will interest Americans, as if we hadn't been gawking for the past 2.5 hours. So he led us up the Victorian Tower and through hallways and ramps and back alleys, as far as we knew, into a big storage room that was filled with racks and shelves and cabinets stuffed to the gills with loose rolls that looked like wrapping paper or wallpaper or something. The young man handed Vicki a scroll, and it was tied with a red ribbon or red tape. Did you ever wonder where the phrase government red tape comes from? It's that little tape they tie around these rolls. Vicki asked if she was supposed to untie the ribbon, and he nodded. And so she did. And she unrolled the Stamp Act of 1765, the original. It had King George III's personal signature in the upper right-hand corner. That man may have been insane for part of his life, but he had very neat, concise penmanship. That Stamp Act, the document she was holding, was the first direct tax imposed by the British Parliament on its American colonies. And it was in protest of this act that American colonists began to formulate theories of their rights to govern themselves through their elected leaders. Only 11 years after King George III neatly signed his name in the upper corner, the American colonies challenged the belief thousands of years old, that monarchies and aristocracies were ordained by God to rule. Instead, the colonies dared to declare all men are created equal. 23 years after the passage of the Stamp Act, just about the lifetime of some DMACC junior and senior college students, just about 23 years, the American people elected their first president and began the American experiment in self-government. And it was the original copy of the act that had started it all off. That's what Vicki was holding. I have heard about the Stamp Act. I have read about the Stamp Act. I have taught about the Stamp Act. You can call it up on the internet and read it, but the combination of the authentic thing and its story, holding the act itself and understanding the train of events that this very document put into motion, that was a moving experience I will never forget. What about this category called historical processes? What's that? At Living History Farms, one of the most successful educational programs is the Live-In, when school classes come out and spend a day at the 1850 pioneer cabin or the 1900 farmhouse going through the daily routines of the era. Of course, there is cooking. They make their own noon meal. In fact, some in the group spend much of the morning getting it ready, and most kids love it. They sit around the kitchen table and make their own noodles or beef stew or rolls, cookies. They peel apples and cook them down to applesauce. "Ooh, this is neat, Mrs. Johnson. I wish we got to do this every day." At that point in the conversation, the good farms interpreter might casually drop this little fact. A study in 1895 by the Quaker Oats Company, and by the way, Dorothy Schweder was the one who shared this fact with me when we were office mates. A study found that the average farm wife was spending 5 hours a day in meal preparation and cleanup. You heard it, 5 hours a day. If it were left to me at our house, it would be closer to 5 hours a week. I define gourmet cooking as any recipe that requires 3 different ingredients that don't all come from the same box. The farm staff would ask the school kids while they are peeling potatoes, "How would your life be different if you had to spend 5 hours a day getting meals? What couldn't you do that you now do if you had to spend 5 hours a day in the kitchen?" Give that one some thought yourselves. When I was at the State Historical Society and working with Jack Lufkin, we opened an exhibit with 100 inventions of the 20th century called "A Few of Our Favorite Things." There were items that everyone would think about: automobiles, radios, TV, computers. There was a microwave oven and examples of processed foods that helped reduce the time we spend in the kitchen. But the most intriguing items are the ones that have become such a familiar part of our landscape that we take them for granted. But imagine life without them. Aspirin tablets. People had headaches before the invention of aspirin. What did they do? Cellophane tape. Zippers. Jell-O. Basic skills tests. How about polio vaccine? The purpose of the exhibit was not to focus on these specific 100 items, but to get visitors thinking about the incredible impact that technology has had on the daily lives of Iowa families over the past 100 years. When you look at the display cases with these items, often your first response is, imagine life without. Imagine life without tennis shoes, t-shirts. Imagine life without Roto-Rooter, invented in Des Moines, Iowa. You may discover you don't want to think too long about life without Roto-Rooter. It's as though we look back at the past in pity, picturing a family in 1900 sitting around their living room after supper, lamenting the fact that I Love Lucy won't come on for 54 years. but we tend to think of their lives in terms of what we have but they lacked. Imagine life without. I would love to be able to spend an hour here on this subject. Okay, history illuminates not only our past, it can help us imagine our future. You take for granted iTunes and GPS and Bluetooth, but don't get smug and think we're the end of the process. Jump ahead 100 years. What will your great-grandchildren pity us for living without? What will be commonplace routines in daily life 100 years from now that we haven't even started to think about? It is good for us to stretch our imaginations occasionally and look back at where we have been to provoke us into thinking a little about where we're going. People and things and routines are some essential components of our past. Historical places, a third factor, are also important. I want to share a personal experience that I had that was directly inspired by the place where it occurred and its story. I have shared this before here at DMAC, but I know of no better illustration of the power of the combination of place and story. On a tour of Northeast Iowa evaluating tourism possibilities, our group found ourselves standing in the farmyard of the birthplace of Norman Borlaug. Borlaug is sometimes called the father of the Green Revolution for his work in increasing food production in the Third World. The farm is near Cresco, Iowa, in Howard County, about 15 miles south of the Minnesota border. I assure you, the Borlaug homestead is never going to compete with the Grand Canyon or Epcot Center as a tourist destination. There is nothing unusual about the physical appearance of the farmstead itself. The home is a big, square, white farmhouse in the neighborhood of big, square, white farmhouses built by hardworking Norwegian families. Nearby was the plain white rural schoolhouse that Borlaug attended, and there was nothing special about it either. But as I was standing there, all of a sudden the pieces came together. The bones started to rattle, and I realized three incredible connections that linked that spot back into Iowa history. So let me start at the early end of that chain of events and work forward. The curtain opens on connection number one, shortly after the Civil War on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames, in what is now the Farmhouse Museum. Early Iowa State agriculture professors lived there so they could be close to the farm operation that provided hands-on experience for ag students. One Professor Joseph Budd lived there with his family that included a little girl named Etta May. Etta grew up wanting to study art, but since Iowa State had no art classes, she went east to school and returned to the Midwest to teach at Simpson College in Indianola. There in her painting studio, she made a connection with a young black man, the son of former slaves in Missouri, who had walked the 30 miles to Indianola from Winterset on the possibility that the Methodist College might be willing to admit a student of his race. Simpson did, and the young man enrolled in Etta Budd's art courses. He loved to paint, and he especially liked to paint still life studies of plants and flowers. As a matter of fact, he also was a good gardener of those plants and flowers, and Etta Budd helped him support himself doing gardening jobs for Indianola families. The young man's name was George Washington Carver, and he and Etta Budd became good friends. As his teacher, Budd took Carver aside one day and gave him the tough love message that he needed to think about something other than art as a career. He was okay, Budd told him, but he was never going to support himself or a family with his paintings. She encouraged him to think about studying plants and offered to go with him to enroll at Iowa State, where her father taught. He considered it and agreed. When Etta returned later to visit him on the Ames campus, she found that he was eating in the school food service, but because his skin was dark, he was eating his meals in the kitchen rather than with other students. This was unacceptable to Etta Budd, so she brought him into the dining room with the white students and ate her meals with him until he became a familiar figure at mealtime and accepted by his classmates. Carver became a brilliant biology student, went on for graduate work at Iowa State, and upon graduation was offered a position on the faculty, the first black teacher that Iowa State had ever hired. He later took a teaching and research job at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, where he developed crops and farming practices that greatly improved the lives of impoverished black farmers across the South. Connection number 2. While Carver was a teacher at Iowa State, he took long walks into the surrounding fields, studying and gathering plants for research and for his classrooms. On some of these walks, he took along a little friend, a 6-year-old boy, the son of a dairy science professor. Carver shared his love of plants with that boy, and the boy responded enthusiastically. At the age of 11, that boy began doing his own experiments with different varieties of corn. That boy's name was Henry A. Wallace. As an adult, Wallace continued his fascination with corn breeding, developed some of the first hybrid varieties, and publicized his findings to farmers in his family's popular journal, Wallace's Farmer Magazine. He founded Pioneer Hybrid Seed Corn Company and watched hybrid seed double and then nearly triple per acre yields of Midwestern cornfields. In 1933, in the worst years of the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed Henry A. Wallace to be Secretary of Agriculture, a post Wallace held for 8 years. In 1940, Roosevelt picked Wallace as Vice President, where Wallace served during World War II. Connection number 3. Following the grueling presidential campaign of 1940, Wallace made a trip to Mexico to study corn production. Corn was the staple in the diet of most Mexican families, but the yields were so much lower than on American farms, especially Iowa farms using hybrid varieties, that most Mexican farm families lived barely above the subsistence level. It was Wallace's idea to create agriculture experiment stations, like those operated by Iowa State, to develop improved corn varieties adapted to local Mexican growing conditions. On his return to the U.S., he proposed the idea to the Rockefeller Foundation. Wallace's proposal for a system of third world experiment stations fell on fertile ground. Let me here tell the tale as it is related in the Wallace biography by former Iowa Senator John Culver and Des Moines Register reporter John Hyde. Their work won the Best Book of the Year award from the State Historical Society in 2001. The Rockefeller Foundation had begun to recognize that its worldwide public health programs, which had contributed effectively to controlling debilitating diseases such as hookworm, yellow fever, and malaria, might be saving people from disease only to subject them to slow starvation resulting from inadequate diets. In short order, the foundation appointed a small survey commission to explore what might be done in Mexico. The result was the establishment of an agricultural experiment station in Mexico, the first in a worldwide series of research stations established by the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations that led to vast food production increases in Latin America, India, the Philippines, and other developing nations across the globe. By 1948, Mexico, for the first time since the revolution in 1910, had no need to import food. 20 years after the beginning of the experiment stations program, corn production in Mexico had doubled and wheat production had increased 5-fold. in spite of an unprecedented increase in population, the per capita food supply was greater in 1963 than it had been in 1943. One of the first scientists to join the Rockefeller Station in Mexico, a young Iowa agronomist named Norman Borlaug, would win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his development of high-yielding wheat. The work of Borlaug and others in expanding yields of corn, wheat, and rice averted worldwide famine and saved an estimated 1 billion lives over the next half century. 1 billion lives. 1970 was the first year the Peace Prize had ever gone to someone in agriculture. There is no Nobel Prize for agriculture or food production as there is in chemistry or physics or literature. The Peace Prize seemed to be the only way to honor Borlaug, but some on the committee were determined, and the Nobel Peace Prize it was. I was standing in the yard behind the Borlaug house when the three connections came together. Edibud to Carver, Carver to Wallace, Wallace to Borlaug. The players were all Iowans. What a surprise! Don't we know that important things happen somewhere else? That what happens locally is not really significant in the grand scheme of things? And I became aware again of the power of place to inspire, if you know its history. This place, where a little boy grew up, went to school, learned to read, and watched how things grow. No one told Etta Budd that was her job to feed 1 billion people, but in acting to end a stupid and demeaning practice that belittled her student and her friend, she helped to set in motion a sequence of events that saved from starvation 1 out of every 5 people then on the face of the earth. In our own quiet way, Iowa does its own thing. We feed the world. It is altogether appropriate that the World Food Prize is in Iowa. We should have the World Computer Prize. The machine that has revolutionized the world forever, we gave it birth. It belonged to us first. It was not invented somewhere else. It is history that breathes the breath into the relics of our past and makes them live again in us. It is not a unit of social studies on transportation or memorization of our state bird and state tree and state flower. It is history, the relationship of Iowans to events over time in this place. It is history that provides the flesh to connect people and things and routines and places to each other and breathes life into them. It is history that makes their accomplishments our heritage and admonishes us that we too play a role in the ongoing story. I have lived among Iowans, past and present. I have met them on the street and in the classroom, at the state fair, and selling their pies on RAGBRAI. I have observed them in person and from afar in history journals, newspapers, and microfilm. I have watched them buy their first Model Ts, build their one-room schools, and adjust the knobs on their first television sets, their triumphs and tragedies, but most of all, the ordinary routines of their daily lives. A French philosopher tells us that the goal in life is not to set out to do extraordinary things, but to do ordinary things with an awareness of their extraordinary significance. Ordinary Iowans, past and present, if we take the time to listen, will teach us the compassion of community, the significance of civility, the worth of work. Yes, Dorothy, it is important to tell the stories that breathe breath into the dry bones of our past and make them live again. the stories of ordinary Iowans, ordinary people doing ordinary things of extraordinary significance. Amen. Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
You were talking about 100 years ago, and you said, well, we can pity them. Are there any ways that we can pity, that they can pity us?
When you have worked in a different time period, like at Living History Farms, you see advantages and disadvantages. It's interesting when you interpret the 1850 farmhouse, you can say the same thing to one group and they will say, ooh, I wish we lived like this. The family is together, they depend on each other, they get up and they have a close bond, you're close to the land. They say it was a much simpler time. I'm not sure I buy that. But the way some people would view 1850 in terms of social relationships versus 2012 in terms of days that get chopped up into little bits. I like the definition of like the explanation, the difference between time orientation and task orientation. At the Pioneer Farm, if you got done with a task mid-afternoon, you might take the rest of the afternoon off. You didn't have to stay there until 5 o'clock because that's what your job was doing. I think any age has its strengths and has its drawbacks. The technology that we have today has strengths and it has its drawbacks. If it makes us think in terms of 140 characters at a time, that's a drawback in my mind. So I think there are balances. I think there are things we are losing. I think there are things that we've gained. And I like the term sustainability. What is there about our culture now that we can sustain as a positive? What are the things we're doing now that we can't sustain because we don't have the resources to look ahead? But I think that looking back is often a valuable tool.
Talk about how technology is going to change the way we view and learn about history.
As a historian, let me look back. One of the things that one of the major sources that historians have had have been written materials. Thomas Jefferson got up at 4 o'clock every morning and wrote 3 or 4 hours letters to people. They were thoughtful letters, and he wrote and sent those out to his friends, and we have those stacks of his thought. Please don't make anyone read my emails for the past 18 years. They're like the Missouri River. They're 3 miles wide and 1 inch deep in terms of thought. You just rattle them off. Where do we get those insights into what we're thinking that used to be around with written resources, text messages, when all your thinking can be expressed in 140 characters, you're not thinking very much. I'm sorry, but that's tends to go. That's a downside, but in other abilities, the ability to capture what's going on is incredible. We were just going through some historic photographs with a friend, and she's now 91. It used to be that when you took a photograph, it was a major event. People stood up straight, they all smiled, they were usually dressed well because it was going to be an event. Now you snap 12 digital pictures and it's no big deal. We have the capacity to capture primary source material as it happens. Do we have the interpretive materials that will tell what people are thinking about, how they regarded it, and so forth? Suddenly we've got an avalanche of data. How will we interpret it? That's one of my concerns. These are not yes or no short answer essays. Give me a multiple choice.
Tom, name 3 things that you think make Iowans distinct.
We live in Iowa. We don't live in Missouri. In her book, Ruth Benedict, talking about America writing right after World War II, uses a wonderful analogy. She talks about constellations of culture. It's not that we have unique things, it's the arrangement of things here. I think Iowans' emphasis on community is very strong and very positive. I think we still have a strong work ethic. Maybe not the people you know, but there are some people around here who must have a good work ethic. I think that some of the things that Dorothy mentioned. What were the things you mentioned? I like those. Education is one. I think we are surprisingly liberal social thinkers against what people think we are. I think we're pretty egalitarian, willing to take people as they are and not stuff them into categories, in part because we deal with them face to face around here. I think those are some characteristics of Iowans. Yeah.
You mentioned liberal social thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
In the recent past, Tom?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And let's call it electoral politics as representative of people's actions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we are national. The United States is national politically in that we hear the same news channels, we get fed the same information. But what I would tend to think, it's been my experience at the community level, when we deal with each other on a one-to-one basis, we tend to deal with each other as people and not as stereotypes. When I was doing my study of Jefferson, and in the 1920s with the Catholic and Protestant divisions and the Ku Klux Klan rearing its ugly head in Iowa, what I found was that when Protestants and Catholics worked together on a one-to-one basis, they might have continued to think in terms of stereotypes, but they said, oh, that doesn't apply to my friends. We got over some of those barriers. And I think that's true. And of course, it's a relative question. Who are you going to compare us with? But I think we're pretty open.
Well, in the interest of time, one more question.
Yeah,
It's not a question, but when we worked at Living History Farms, you shared an anecdote with me about sometimes significant history is being told to you, but if you're focusing on something else, you don't always see it. And you use it as an example when you wrote your book on prairie grass roots. You went to a farmhouse and interviewed an older lady, and you wanted to talk about something else, but she kept coming back to the day that she learned how to do something. Do you remember what I'm...
Yep. I interviewed Mrs. Arvilla Long, and I was talking about how she learned how to drive a car. And she didn't want to do that interview because when it was going to be a history lecture, she thought I was going to ask her about presidents and wars, and she thought she'd come across as stupid. But I said, no, I just want to talk to you. How did you use the automobile? And we got into the interview, and then I asked, how did you learn how to drive a car? And suddenly, the light came on. And she started talking about how the family had a Model T. And that doesn't mean anything to most of us today, because when we want to back up a car, we put the gear shift till it says R and then push the accelerator and it moves backward. But a Model T had 3 pedals on the floor, and you had to get the clutch, and then you had to push the reverse pedal, and you had to balance them just right after you got the little needles at the start on your carburetor to be right. So it was quite a problem. She knew how to go forward, but she didn't know how to back it up. And her husband would park the car in the corn crib that had a rear wall. so she would have to ask her husband to back up the car. And he said, I can't do it, I'm working in the fields. So she couldn't go to town. She wanted to go to town, but she couldn't. But she said, I'm going to back up the car. And she was telling me this in an interview and getting more and more excited telling me this. And I thought, you learned how to back up the car. What is this? And I thought, where am I going to use this in my research? And she said she backed up the car and she went to town. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, when I was commuting back and forth between Ames and Jefferson, it fell on me like a ton of bricks. When she knew how to back up the car, she could go to town when she wanted to go. For generations, centuries before, farm wives were dependent on their husbands when they wanted to leave the car or leave the farm. But when she learned how to back up the Model T Ford, it was her get out of jail free card. It was Bastille Day. She could go to town when she wanted to go. And I missed it because I was focusing on the mechanics of how you learn how to back up a car. For that dimension, history is wonderful because it's like a huge giant diamond with 22,000 faces you can look in. And depending what angle you're looking at that story, this says what you're going to see in it. So for me, that story about Mrs. Long backing up the Model T was an insight into women or farm women, but it was also an insight. I missed it the first time around because I was looking on something else. Thank you. I had no idea what you were talking about at first. Thank you.
Funding for this program was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation. Generations of families and friends who feel passionate about the programs they watch on Iowa Public Television.